Welcome to That Business Show 2.0. I'm Jamie Maloney, your host. Each weekday morning, we air new episodes on thatbusinessnetwork.com at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and then made available on iTunes and on YouTube. We're seeing steady growth on iTunes. Just really started taking iTunes seriously towards the end of last year, and then took a month off in between the radio and the new show here, 2.0. So please help the show get some legs under us on the on iTunes. Best way to do that is to subscribe, download some episodes, leave a review. All that stuff helps in the SEO of iTunes. Still trying to learn that search engine, how to get found in the muddied waters of iTunes, just like any other business or a thing that you do. Getting found is 90% of the battle. I do believe the show is a great product with a lot of good information and a lot of different resources that we can offer to listeners. And so if you're a regular listener on the program, we need your help. Again, subscribe, leave reviews, talk about the show, ask others to do the same. And also, if you can ever need my assistance as a listener with a connection to somebody in the industry, one of these industries, one of these past guests, happy to make connections for you. Again, over 1,200 different contacts, and also soon to be released for membership on thatbusinessnetwork.com. But I've talked about that a little in the past, but that's still, again, under development, the membership site on that platform over there. Today's program, I want to talk a little bit about musical influence. I'm a big fan of music. I come out of the 80s scene primarily, although I was born in 77. I'm 39 years old today, and grew up as a child of the 80s and a teenager in the 90s. And so my loyalties are torn between the 80s hair metal and the 90s alternative rock, but it's a big influence in my life, and it's kind of my stress relief. And where I go to get away from things is to music, and whether it's YouTube videos or the radio or satellite radio, big listener of music. And I wanted to talk today about some of the musical influences in my life, and how they rank in musical history. And so I wanted to kind of count down, what I considered, the top 5 bands in my own sphere of influence. So we're going to do the top 5 bands that I considered, in my own genre, my own sphere of influence. This is nothing official. This is just something that I put together my own self. And so, coming in at number 5 is probably Nirvana. They were a great band, and I can remember the first time seeing them on MTV. And everybody talks about how they were the band that destroyed the 80s metal scene. And I can remember watching them on MTV, and I ran to the television, I ran to the phone after they came on. I called my best friend and said, "You got to turn on MTV, you got to hear this band. It's unlike anything I've ever heard." And when they played Smells Like Teen Spirit, simple song by today's standards, nothing elaborate, nothing really edgy, but it had a sound unique in and of itself, and it changed the musical environment. It was not even their first album. It was the B-side of that particular release, and a radio station somewhere started playing it, and it instantly caught on. And you think about this is before the internet and before YouTube, and so they didn't even have that level of influence. This took off through the traditional means of getting radio play, which is how bands and how songs used to have to make their impact on the culture, was through the radio stations. Now they just put it up on YouTube, and you're going to carry influence simply through that channel. Smells Like Teen Spirit, though, was a tremendous hit and led to many, many more hits, and then to the ultimate demise of Kurt Cobain in 1994 when he killed himself, and that was the end of Nirvana. But then that spun off Foo Fighters with what's his name there from the forget the guy's name off the top of my head, but then that led on to other great music. But Nirvana was truly a tremendous band, one of my great influences of the 90s, and some band that I still pull up and listen to quite sometimes. Coming in at number 4, I'd had to probably put in Motley Crue. Motley Crue is a a tremendous influence on my life. Love the band, love everything that represented Motley Crue. This is 4 guys coming out of L.A. in 1981. Vince Neil, Tommy Lee, Mick Mars, Nikki Sixx, all coming together to form this band that was so revolutionary, so influential, and that until just 2 years ago was still touring. And no one say they were putting out. They haven't put out anything since I think 2008, since the release of Saints of Los Angeles. I think that was their last original album. But they continued to tour. They were broken apart for a short time in the 1990s. They put out an album with John Corabi as lead singer there for one of the albums. When Vince Neil went out onto a solo project and released the Exposed album, and came back to the band sometime in the I think shortly after, in the late 90s and into 2000s is when he started to play with Motley Crue again. He went on to kind of gain a lot of weight and lose some of that shriek that his voice had, and the sound of a rocker's voice is so tantamount to their place in history. And I always thought Vince Neil of the 1980s had one of the best rock voices or best metal voices up there. And so Motley Crue is probably my 4th favorite band of all time. I know all their songs. My favorite album is, of course, the Dr. Feelgood album, hit after hit after hit coming off of that album. And that was also, again, right around, that transition period in your life, entering teenage years. And at that time it was, 1990 or 91 when, no, 89, I think. It was 89 when Dr. Feelgood album came out. But I may be a little bit off on the years on that. And so a great influence and one of my favorite bands to this day. I got to see them a couple of years ago on their farewell tour when they came through Tampa at the amphitheater, and then they closed up their final show at their home in LA in 2015. And I just watched that show on one of the television stations. I forget the name of the station right now, but they played their final show there, and you see it's kind of funny too, because as Tommy Lee was playing the drums, and he always goes across that roller coaster, and actually I've seen Motley Crue a couple of times, and in the past the roller coaster went around the back of the set, and now the new design had come out like a snake into the crowd. And as he's doing his drum solo, the apparatus gets stuck with him upside down on the very final show. And I don't know if the drum set had ever broken down before. It wasn't the drum set; it was the roller coaster itself. So he's stuck upside down, confused for a moment, and they have to come up there and unstrap him and release him all during his live drum solo show or set on the final Motley Crue show that they ever performed together in 2000. I think it was New Year's Eve on December of 2015. Coming in at number 3, I had to put Guns N' Roses. Guns N' Roses frontman Axl Rose has always been, in my opinion, the best frontman in the history of rock or heavy metal. And I don't even really like to call these bands heavy metal. I think I more classify them as hard rock. Heavy metal to me is that screeching, inaudible sound of people whose voices are scratchy and incoherent. And I know some people will say that's what hard rock, that's what these bands you're talking about sound like, but that's not really the case. You can typically understand a lot of these bands. You can't so much understand them when in some of these heavy metal, and some people call it thrash metal or death metal. I'm not into that. I never did like those types of bands. One band that I did like that was in that scene was probably Pantera. They were probably the best band to actually put out good quality music that was semi-understandable, but had rhythm and sound that you could actually enjoy. And of course, a lot of people in the rock business know what ultimately happened with Pantera. And the shooting of Dimebag Darrell when he was playing with Damage Plan. It's probably been about 10 years now or so, but unfortunate, that Pantera had to go out the way that they did, and a lot of people, had blamed Philip Anselmo for the demise of the band. He was the front man for Pantera, developed some back pain because of his just crazy antics on stage. The man was like a maniac when he sang on stage and caused himself, bodily harm just in how he performed. But developed alcoholism and drug problems, and led to the downfall and the splitting up of the band. And then Damage Plan was split off, which was Dimebag and his brother Vinnie Paul, who played the drums. And in just playing a small show, one of their fans, upset that they had broken up the band, shot Dimebag Darrell on stage in front of the crowd. And fortunately, an officer arrived on scene, or was on scene fairly quickly, and was able to kill the gunman before he hurt more people. But we lost Dimebag Darrell, a great guitarist in the heavy metal scene back there some 10 years ago. So Pantera, not one of my top 5 favorite bands, but definitely with some great screeching heavy metal music. But I bring them up because I like to say that they are the difference between good heavy metal and whatever, and then hard rock, which is the 80s hair metal bands, and then what everybody else out there classifies as heavy metal, death metal, thrash metal, the inaudible screeching music that drives me up a wall. And so I'm not a fan of that. I'm a fan of good old-fashioned 80s hair metal bands, nice 70s country rock. I even like the 60s movement, and going even back into the 50s with a little bit of Elvis, and of course the Beatles, who are a tremendous influence, but not one of my favorite bands. But altogether, though, if you think about it, no band has been more influential than the Beatles on a grand scale. But me personally, I never got into the Beatles to the way that I have these other bands. But yeah, definitely got to put a shout out for the Beatles. They led the British invasion into the rock scene coming out of England in the 50s, and led to so many British bands coming over to America and finding success in the musical days of the 50s and 60s. Take a break here. When I come back, I'll wrap up my musical influence countdown with my top 2 favorite bands on That Business Show 2.0, where business becomes show business.
Hi, welcome to Yeager's. We just want to take a minute and show you what we're all about. At Yeager's, our primary business is hardwood flooring, although we are remodelers for kitchen, bath, and general construction. We operate a fleet of shop-at-home vans that have all the flooring-type products: hardwood flooring, laminate flooring, tiles, stone, what have you. So we're able to come out first with products in our vehicles and take a look at the setting, how the colors will work, and then to be able to come up with some options and ideas for you. If that's not good enough, we have a large distribution center that we inventory product and have a nice display area.
Welcome back to That Business Show 2.0 with your host Jamie Maloney, where business becomes a show business. Today's topic is musical influences. I like to do some solo shows on the program from time to time, a little bit of a difference in development of the program versus the show coming up through the radio, where I never did solo shows with the exception of I think 2 or 3 times where people didn't show up in a live segment and I had to think of something off the spot, and it's a little bit unnerving to be live and have to come up with a topic versus recording something and coming up with a topic. You give me something I can generally ramble on for 20 or 30 minutes, which is what I have to do per show here when I don't have a guest. And just give me a topic and I can usually fill the time with it. Hopefully you find some value, find some influence and some interest in the off-business topics and more about myself outside of the business realm in which I tend to operate. But we're talking about the top 5 bands of my time and what I consider the top 5. And coming in at 5, I was thinking Nirvana is my 5th favorite. Motley Crue coming in at number 4. Guns N' Roses, my 3rd favorite band of all time. Number 2, Metallica. And oftentimes I tell people they're my favorite band, but there is one band that I do consider greater than any band in terms of musical influence. I'll get to them in just a moment. But Metallica is a band that is so unique and so talented that to this day they continue to release new albums. That's one thing that separates them from all the other 80s influences, such as, well, Guns N' Roses has put out new albums, but it's been with Axl and his new crew and the other. They're back together on a reunion tour, but it's not the same as what it was when they broke up in 94 or 95 or so. After the Terminator released a song that they put out, "You Could Be Mine." That was one of their final songs that they played together before breaking apart. And even listening to Axl sing these days is kind of brutal. He had, in my opinion, the best rock voice of the 80s metal singers, but today is absolutely horrible. He's overweight. He always had problems with his voice to begin with. He would sometimes not even go out on shows on time, just a chronically late individual. That was one of the things that broke up that band, was his just prima donna sense of well-being or sense of self. And so the other band members just got tired of him trying to were being treated like employees of the band. And so Axl, again, kept control of the band. He kept control of the rights. And then we all know that the majority of Guns N' Roses band with Slash and Duff McKagan and Matt Sorum, all of them broke off and formed Velvet Revolver with Scotty Weiland at the front. And that was a great band too. And I wonder how much that music would have been Guns N' Roses' music instead of Velvet Revolver's. I don't know who was doing the writing or anything, but Velvet Revolver really spun off some great hits. And while I don't necessarily consider them a top 5, they definitely had some influence in the late 90s and were a tremendous band. Scott Weiland, a great frontman leading Stone Temple Pilots, which was the Plush album, was one of the greatest works of musical art of the 90s. But we all know that Scott Weiland had his own internal demons and own internal struggles with addictions, and we lost him several years back to a drug overdose, I believe. But Velvet Revolver and the years spent with the guys from Guns N' Roses was absolutely tremendous. But Axl continued to perform with, I didn't even buy any of the Guns N' Roses albums or even listen to him when he played with the other people. He finally put out that Chinese Democracy album, which took like 15 years to put out. And I think I heard like one song from it, but I wasn't interested in it. Ever since the Use Your Illusion albums, I didn't really consider them as much of an influence with the new stuff that comes out. But their Appetite for Destruction album, which came out in 1987, released at number 1, sold more albums than any other album in the 80s, and I think for rock. They're definitely up there with that album. But that was the first CD that I ever bought. I actually bought it at the same time that I bought Slaughter's Stick It To Ya, which came out around the same time. But Appetite for Destruction was one of those albums that song after song after song was a hit. And there's not one song on that album that I didn't like. And that was rare. I would typically buy a CD for one song. Maybe there's a second song on there that became a hit. Maybe there's a third song on there that I found that didn't get radio play that I kind of liked, but nothing like Appetite for Destruction. That is one of those few albums that was put out by rock bands that every single song was a hit. And that was their first release. That was what put Guns N' Roses on the map with their very first release. Can you imagine being just a small garage local band and then coming out with an album like that? An incredible work of art by incredibly talented crew of musicians with Axl at the helm. It's just too bad he was quite a difficult individual to deal with. Who knows what else Guns N' Roses could have put out. But again, coming back to what I was talking about, the second favorite band of my time and my generation, Metallica. Putting out new album after new album after new album. This is a band, again, formed in the 1980s, I think 1980 or 81. Lars Ulrich, the drummer, puts an ad in a local newspaper for looking for a musician to play with. James Hetfield, the front man, responds, and then they begin to put together the beginning pieces of Metallica. A lot of people don't even know that Dave Mustaine, the front man for Megadeth, was one of the original founding members of Metallica, but he had such a problem with alcoholism that they threw him out. And this was a band who had their own battles with alcoholism and drugs, and to be thrown out of Metallica because you were too difficult and too much of an alcoholic, that says something about the man Dave Mustaine. He would go on to form Megadeth, and while they never achieved the same level of success that Metallica did, Megadeth definitely put out a lot of great albums, and I am a Megadeth fan, just not top 5 fan. And so they put out some great early albums with Kill 'Em All, Master of Puppets, Ride the Lightning, and then they had the tragic accident in 1987 that saw the death of Cliff Burton, their bassist, and one of James Hetfield's really good friends. And it was bus slipped on or lost control on some black ice. I think it was in Sweden where it happened. Everybody was asleep. The ironic point of it is James and Cliff had gotten into a small argument that night about who was going to sleep in that bunk where Cliff won. And so Cliff won the argument or whatever and got the bunk that he wanted. And then the bus wrecked, and there was a person, him, in that location that ended up getting thrown from the bus and killed. They would go on to replace him with Jason Newsted, and then put out some great hits. The Black Album, which was really their transitional piece, which alienated a number of fans, but then brought them in new fans. And so between them and then 2008, they just had a little bit of a different sound. And so the rockers of the 80s, a lot of them would talk bad about Metallica because they left their original sound. But I was of the school that, these guys developed, they evolved, they stood relevant to the musical times, whereas all these other 80s bands were playing their recycled hits. They were still evolving. They were true artists putting out material that was, still on the forefront of what consumers wanted to hear. And the Black Album was just one of those great releases that came out of that. And then their release, Saint Anger in 2008, which had a whole another unique sound to it. Their time spent with the San Francisco Symphony Harmonic was a tremendous work of art where they're playing with a symphony in the background. And I always wondered, in the 90s, if a power band like Metallica or somebody would play with a symphony, and then they did that in 2000, and such great music came out of that. But now they're back to their original sound with their latest albums. They got a new bassist, Robert Trujillo, that's since replaced Jason Newsted. Jason Newsted never really fit in with the band, although he was there for some 15 plus years. Him and James Hetfield never saw eye to eye, but Robert Trujillo now been the bassist with him since 2008, since the Saint Anger album. I think that was his original album that he appeared on. Still touring, and they're coming to Orlando here in about a month, so I'm going to try to make my way over and see them. But love Metallica because of the influence and their ability to put out new music. So my number one choice, the best band, is completely in a category in and of it by itself, and that's Pink Floyd. No band is ever compared to Pink Floyd. No band is even in the same arena as Pink Floyd. Album after album with different songs and different hits and completely different sounds from their original music and the previous albums. Go back and listen to Pink Floyd in the 60s when they first came on the scenes, when Syd Barrett, the original founding member, was still playing with them, and Roger Waters. Their sound was so unique, so underground, that it didn't get any radio play, but the underground culture propped them up and then brought them in through the 70s and ultimately in the 80s. And they really got to be known when they put out the Brick in the Wall albums, and that got a tremendous amount of radio play and tremendous staying power at #1. But such turmoil and turbulence within that band really cost, I think, its legacy. Roger Waters, first off, Syd Barrett didn't die. He developed a mental condition, paranoid schizophrenia, took a bad acid trip, some people say, ended up leaving the band in the 70s. David Gilmour had came in the 60s, and there was he wasn't one of the originals, but when Syd left, Roger Waters tried to take more of a control of the band. David Gilmour and Roger Waters never saw really eye to eye, and it caused a lot of leadership problems within the band. And so the band would break up in the early 80s, I believe, but they came back in various forms without David Gilmour, with David Gilmour. They played together for their last time at the 2004. There was a concert, I forget what it was. It was one of those festivals where, like Live Aid or something. No, it wasn't Live Aid. But that was the last time that the original members of the band, minus Syd Barrett. He's an interesting musician too, if you ever study musicians. Syd Barrett gave the name to Pink Floyd. He was the founding member who was childhood friends with Roger Waters and formed that unity amongst the bands, Nick Mason, Richard Wright, and who would go on to become Pink Floyd. Tremendous band. Nobody out there liked them. I listened to them all the time. If you've never listened to Pink Floyd, check them out. There's also a unique movie out there called Pink, which is about The Wall. It's set to the music of The Wall. Very, very interesting movie, and not a traditional movie by any means, put out in the 1980s, set to the songs of the album The Wall. And Roger Waters still tours. He's not Pink Floyd, but he sings a lot of Pink Floyd's music, which was his. He was one of the primary writers of the band, and I got to see him a couple of years ago in Tampa. But if you ever get to see Roger Waters, highly recommend it. But Pink Floyd is the band that I consider the greatest musical influence on myself and a lot of musical people as well. But nobody has ever been able to produce a sound as unique as Pink Floyd. So again, you've been listening to That Business Show 2.0 with your host, Jamie Maloney, where business becomes show business.